The Miller family home stood on a mountainside, surrounded by dense forest. In winter, this place was especially secluded. Snow covered everything around, and the road to the nearest town became almost impassable. The Millers got used to this isolation, considering it part of their way of life. One morning after a heavy snowstorm overnight, Jack Miller, the head of the family, went out of the house to clear the path of snow. While wielding a shovel, he suddenly noticed something strange. On the snow-white surface next to the porch, tracks were clearly visible, large, deep, as if someone heavy had left them. They led from the forest straight to the house. "Liz, come here," he called to his wife. Elizabeth came out onto the porch, pulling on her coat. "What happened?" "Look at this," he said, pointing to the tracks. "Someone came in the night, but—" Elizabeth frowned. The tracks did indeed end right at their porch. Jack walked around the house, trying to figure out where the intruder had come from, but there was only untouched snow all around. "Great discovery? Maybe the snowstorm just blew them back," Elizabeth suggested uncertainly. Jack nodded, but the feeling of something was wrong did not leave him. The next day, history repeated itself. In the morning, tracks appeared in the snow again. They began at the tree line and led to the house, but this time there were more of them. The tracks seemed wider, and the snow around them seemed to be pressed into an odd shape, as if someone had been standing there for a long time. "Jack, this doesn't look like a person," Elizabeth said, looking at the tracks. That night, when the family went to bed, everything in the house was enveloped in silence. But in the midst of this silence, close to midnight, the Millers heard a sound. It was a soft, crunching creak, as if someone was carefully stepping on fresh snow right under their windows. Each morning, Jack and Elizabeth found more tracks around the house. They now covered the entire yard, intersecting, forming circles. Their shapes changed. Among the usual footprints, strange marks appeared, as if someone had left symbols in the snow, like ancient runes or carvings. "It's not a blizzard or an animal anymore," Jack said, standing on the porch. He tried to convince himself that it was a joke or the wind, but everything looked too orderly. "Look," Elizabeth whispered, pointing to more tracks. They were long, narrow, with deep furrows on the sides, as if they had been left by claws. That night, the snow fell again, thickly, covering the ground in a white void. The Millers went to bed with a feeling of unease, and closer to midnight, they heard the familiar crunch again. "They're here," Elizabeth whispered, clutching the blanket. Jack stood up, threw on his coat, and picked up his gun. He went to the window and peered out cautiously. Outside, in the moonlight, he saw figures. They were barely visible in the shifting fog, but their shadows were stretched, longer than a person's could be. The moonlight picked out something in the snow, a large symbol trampled around their house. It was a circle, full of intricate lines and patterns that were impossible to understand. "What are they doing?" Elizabeth asked, going to the window. "They're surrounding us," Jack answered hoarsely. In the morning, the symbols were still there. The tracks were even larger, and now they stretched across the entire yard, even going onto the porch. In one of the deep furrows, Jack found something strange, a piece of black, burnt material, like bone. "Jack, they're trying to say something. These marks, they're not just footprints," Elizabeth said quietly, looking at the patterns that now completely surrounded their house. With each passing day, the patterns became more complex, and the footprints multiplied. Now they didn't just surround the house, they seemed to lead somewhere, snaking through the snow, disappearing into the forest, where the sun never reached the ground. At dawn, Jack was the first to go outside to check the yard, as usual. But this time everything was different. The snow lay in a perfectly even layer, as if nothing had happened overnight. No tracks, no symbols, no claws, nothing. He returned to the house, feeling strangely relieved, but also deeply uneasy. "It looks like they're gone," he told Elizabeth, trying to sound convincing. She only nodded, but her eyes betrayed the fear she couldn't hide. The whole day passed in tense silence. They tried to go about their usual business, but every movement, every creak in the house made them flinch. The next day, when Jack got up early, he noticed something strange in the hallway. There was a track on the wooden floor. The same one, long and narrow, with claws that left deep scratches on the boards. The claws stretched all the way to the barred door. "Elizabeth," he called in a trembling voice. She walked over, and then together they discovered new tracks leading through the house. They started in the hallway, stretched through the living room, along the stairs, and disappeared at the door of the nursery, where their children slept. Jack pulled the door open. The room was empty. The beds were made as if no one had touched them. "Where are the children?" Elizabeth whispered, her voice shaking with horror. The tracks appeared again, this time leading to the attic. The creaking of the stairs as Jack climbed seemed deafening in the oppressive silence of the house. It was cold in the attic, and the air was filled with a strange smell of damp and burning. As he rose, the light from the lantern illuminated a terrible scene. Their children were standing in the corner. They were motionless, as if frozen in anticipation. "Jack," Elizabeth began, climbing up after him. But at that moment, the children turned around. Their faces were unnaturally pale, their eyes empty, as if there was nothing human inside them anymore. They simultaneously raised their hands, pointing behind their parents. Jack turned and saw the shadows thickening in the far corner of the attic. They began to stretch, forming the outlines that Jack had seen earlier in the moonlight. The shadows surrounded them, blocking the exit. "We are not alone," Elizabeth whispered, her voice drowned out by the whispers that filled the entire space. The next morning, the house was silent. There was nothing left inside except for strange symbols carved into the floor. The Miller family had disappeared without a trace. Locals who dared to approach told of strange tracks leading from the house into the forest. The tracks began at the porch, but, as before, no one saw them leading back.